I never imagined that the worst sound I'd ever wake up to wouldn't be an alarm or a storm. It'd be absolute silence. The kind of silence that only shows up after something important has already been taken from you. I stepped out onto my driveway with my coffee that Saturday morning, still half asleep, expecting the usual view I'd looked at every day for the last 3 years, and instead I just stood there, frozen. The steel canopy I'd spent months designing was gone. Every solar panel, every support beam, every charging cable I'd installed with my own 2 hands had disappeared, leaving nothing but scraped concrete, broken anchor bolts, and muddy tire tracks leading toward the main road. For a few seconds, my brain refused to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. I actually looked around the neighborhood, wondering if I'd somehow walked to the wrong house. It sounds ridiculous now, but that's honestly where my mind went first. Then reality settled in like a punch to the ribs. Somebody hadn't stolen it. Somebody had removed it on purpose. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 42, divorced, and I've lived in Pine Hollow Estates just outside Lexington for a little over 5 years. I work as an electrical systems engineer, which means I've always been the kind of guy who likes solving problems with diagrams instead of arguments. My neighbors usually described me as quiet. Some probably thought I was boring. I mowed my lawn every Thursday evening, waved at people walking their dogs, kept Christmas lights up exactly 1 week after New Year's, and never gave anyone a reason to complain. The solar canopy wasn't some flashy toy either. It kept my truck shaded during Kentucky summers, powered part of my home, and let me charge my electric pickup without depending entirely on the grid. It had taken almost a year to save enough money for it, and even longer to get every permit approved because our homeowners association loved paperwork almost as much as they loved telling people what shade of beige their mailbox should be. I knew every rule before I poured the first concrete footing. I hired licensed surveyors, submitted engineering drawings, attended 2 HOA review meetings, answered every question they threw at me, and waited almost 4 months before they finally approved the project. That's why none of what I was looking at made any sense. Then I noticed an envelope tucked beneath my welcome mat. No stamp, no address, just my last name written across the front with a black marker. Inside was a single sheet of paper that read, "Structure removed due to community compliance enforcement. Administrative costs will be billed accordingly." No signature, just the HOA seal printed at the bottom. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so unbelievably arrogant that laughing felt healthier than throwing something. Administrative costs? They destroyed my property and planned to send me the bill. I called the HOA office immediately. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. About 20 minutes later, my neighbor across the street, Mrs. Dawson, shuffled over holding her little terrier. She had lived there longer than anyone else and somehow knew everything before everyone else. She looked at the empty driveway, shook her head, and quietly said, "I figured you'd be outside eventually." I asked if she'd seen anything. She hesitated for a moment before telling me she'd woken up around 3 in the morning because of diesel engines. She peeked through her blinds and watched 2 flatbed trucks, floodlights, and what looked like a demolition crew working in my driveway. She assumed I'd hired them until she noticed none of them knocked on my door. One man kept pointing at papers, she said. Everyone else just followed orders. I asked if she recognized him. She nodded slowly. Looked a lot like Martin Kessler. My stomach tightened. Martin was president of the HOA. We'd never had a shouting match or anything dramatic, but he'd made it painfully clear over the last year that he hated anything modern in the neighborhood. According to him, solar equipment ruined the traditional character of Pine Hollow. During one meeting, he'd actually joked that my driveway looked more like Silicon Valley than Kentucky. Most people laughed. I didn't. I remembered exactly how he looked at me after the meeting ended, smiling without ever really smiling. Around noon, I drove to the HOA office. Martin's truck was parked right outside. He welcomed me into his office with the kind of confidence only people with too much authority ever seem to have. Before I could even sit down, he folded his hands and said, "I figured you'd stop by eventually." I asked one simple question. Who authorized tearing down my property? He leaned back in his chair and replied, "The board determined your structure no longer complied with revised community appearance standards." Revised? I stared at him. Those standards were approved after my project was completed. He shrugged like we were discussing the weather. Communities evolve. I told him permits don't magically disappear because someone changes their opinion. He smiled again, slow and patient, like a teacher explaining math to a child. Sometimes doing what's best for the neighborhood requires difficult decisions. That's when I realized something important. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't defensive. He genuinely believed nobody could challenge him. He expected me to yell, threaten a lawsuit, maybe storm out. Instead, I simply stood up, thanked him for his time, and walked toward the door. He laughed quietly behind me and said, "You'll spend more replacing that thing than it's worth fighting us." I paused with my hand on the doorknob, looked back over my shoulder, smiled, and answered, "Maybe." Then I walked outside, got into my truck, and drove home without another word because there was one thing Martin Kessler didn't know about me. And before I made my next move, I wanted to make absolutely sure every single document sitting inside my filing cabinet said exactly what I remembered. The moment I got home, I headed straight for the spare bedroom that doubled as my office, unlocked an old gray filing cabinet, and started pulling folders onto the floor. Most people probably would have called a lawyer first. I called paperwork. My dad used to say memories fade, arguments change, but signed documents never wake up one morning and decide to tell a different story. He spent 30 years working as a county surveyor, and growing up I'd watched him keep copies of everything. Somewhere along the way I picked up the same habit. Within 15 minutes I had my original building permit, the approved engineering plans, photographs from every stage of construction, inspection reports, invoices, emails with the HOA's architectural committee, and the official approval letter signed by 2 board members, including Martin Kessler himself. I stared at his signature for a second and couldn't help smiling. He hadn't just forgotten approving my project. He'd erased it from his own memory because it had become inconvenient. That was different. Forgetfulness could be excused. Deliberately pretending history never happened usually couldn't. I spent the rest of Saturday scanning every document into digital copies, then backed them up twice. Once to cloud storage and once onto an external drive that lived inside my fireproof safe. Maybe that sounds excessive, but engineers tend to assume the worst because we've seen enough things fail when people assume the best. Around dinner time, my phone rang. It was my friend Caleb, a civil engineer I'd known since college. We'd worked together on infrastructure projects before, and if there was anyone I trusted to look at property issues objectively, it was him. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, then asked one question that completely changed the direction of my thinking. "Have you looked at the utility easement?" I frowned. "Why?" "Because I remember something odd from the subdivision drawings years ago. That clubhouse expansion they're building wasn't part of it crossing the southern access corridor." My stomach tightened again. I walked back to the filing cabinet, dug through another folder, and pulled out a large rolled survey map. Caleb stayed on speaker while I spread it across my dining room table. We both went quiet for almost a full minute. Then he laughed. Not loudly, just the kind of laugh that comes from recognizing a mistake somebody else doesn't even know they've made. The HOA's new community recreation center wasn't entirely sitting on common property. Its underground electrical service crossed a privately owned utility access strip, mine. Years earlier, when the subdivision was expanded, the developer had negotiated a limited maintenance corridor across the rear corner of my parcel. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't unrestricted access. It required written authorization before any permanent infrastructure could be installed or modified. I flipped through another binder. No authorization. No amendment. No recorded agreement. Nothing. "Maybe they have newer paperwork," Caleb said carefully. "Maybe," I answered, although something inside me already knew they didn't. Sunday morning, I drove to the county records office when it opened. The clerk recognized me after a few searches over the years and smiled. "Research project?" she joked. "Something like that. We searched every filing connected to the subdivision over the previous 3 years. Easement amendments, utility agreements, construction filings. There was nothing granting the HOA permission to run permanent electrical infrastructure beneath my land. What I did find was even more interesting. Their recreation center had received temporary construction approval pending final utility certification, but the permanent electrical compliance documents hadn't yet been recorded. That didn't automatically mean anything illegal had happened, but it did mean somebody still had paperwork left to finish before everything was truly complete. By Monday morning, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger makes people rush. I wanted precision instead. I hired a property attorney named Laura Mitchell, someone with a reputation for being calm enough to make opposing lawyers nervous. She spent nearly 3 hours reviewing everything before finally closing the last folder. "You know what's unusual?" she asked. I shook my head. "You're not actually asking for damages yet. You're asking whether they had authority in the first place." I nodded. "Exactly." She smiled. "Good. Judges like people who ask the right question before demanding the wrong answer." That afternoon, formal letters went out. One notified the HOA that they had removed privately owned property without legal authorization. Another requested preservation of all emails, meeting minutes, contractor communications, and surveillance footage connected to the demolition. A third went to the utility contractor requesting confirmation of every approval associated with the recreation center's electrical installation. We weren't accusing anyone of fraud. We were simply asking for documentation. Sometimes that's all it takes to make people panic. It only took 48 hours. By Wednesday, Laura called me sounding almost amused. Martin responded personally. "How'd that go?" I asked. "Poorly." Apparently, Martin insisted everything had been approved verbally during a construction meeting. Verbal approval for permanent electrical infrastructure crossing private property. Even I knew that sentence sounded ridiculous. Laura sent one polite email back asking him to identify the date, attendees, and written record supporting that claim. Silence. Meanwhile, another surprise landed in my mailbox. An invoice from the HOA charging me storage fees for disposing of the demolished canopy materials. I stared at the number for a long time before setting it on the counter beside my coffee mug. There was something strangely helpful about that invoice. It proved they weren't denying responsibility anymore. They were documenting it themselves. Mrs. Dawson wandered over later that afternoon, carrying blueberry muffins she'd baked, claiming she had made too many. We both knew she hadn't. She sat on my porch and quietly admitted several neighbors were beginning to ask questions. Apparently, the overnight demolition hadn't stayed secret for very long. People had security cameras. Delivery drivers had noticed equipment. Kids riding bicycles had started asking why my driveway looked empty. Rumors spread quickly in neighborhoods where nothing interesting usually happened. Some people believed I must have violated serious safety rules. Others assumed I'd stopped paying HOA dues. Nobody imagined the board might actually be responsible. That's how power usually works. People assume authority means legitimacy until somebody proves otherwise. Friday morning, my attorney called again. This time her voice carried something different. Excitement. One of the utility contractors had responded to our records request. According to their internal correspondence, they'd repeatedly asked the HOA for final property authorization before energizing the permanent service connection to the recreation center. The response from the HOA project manager simply instructed them to proceed because ownership issues had already been handled internally. Laura read that sentence twice before stopping. "Ethan," she said quietly, "if ownership issues hadn't been handled internally, somebody signed off on something they couldn't verify." I leaned back in my chair and stared out the kitchen window toward the empty space where my solar canopy used to stand. For the first time since all this started, I wasn't thinking about replacing steel beams or broken panels anymore. This had grown into something much bigger than one destroyed structure. Martin hadn't simply overstepped his authority. He'd built an entire strategy around the assumption that nobody would ever bother checking his homework. He underestimated how patient I could be. He underestimated how carefully engineers read diagrams. And more than anything, he underestimated how dangerous a quiet person becomes once they stop trying to win an argument and start collecting evidence instead. The following Monday, county officials scheduled a joint site review with utility inspectors and property record staff. Nobody from the HOA seemed worried yet. Construction crews kept working. Landscaping trucks rolled in and out. Decorative banners announcing the recreation center's grand opening appeared along the entrance road. From the outside, everything looked perfect, but I knew something almost nobody else did. Beneath that polished building, hidden under fresh concrete and neatly planted flower beds, sat a question nobody had been able to answer with a single signed document. And if that answer didn't exist, the celebration Martin had spent 2 years planning was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. The inspection happened on a Tuesday morning under a bright blue sky that couldn't have cared less about the mess waiting beneath the surface. I parked across the street with a cup of gas station coffee and watched 3 county vehicles pull into the construction entrance one after another. A utility inspector climbed out carrying a thick binder followed by 2 property records officials and a survey crew. Martin spotted them almost immediately. Even from a distance, I could see the confidence on his face. He walked over smiling, shaking hands, talking with the easy charm he always seemed to save for people he thought he could impress. For nearly an hour, nothing dramatic happened. They walked the property, compared drawings, measured distances, opened utility boxes, and marked locations with little orange flags. Then I noticed something change. The surveyor stopped talking. One inspector bent down, looked at his paperwork again, then pointed toward the rear utility corridor. Another official asked Martin a question. Martin answered quickly, waving his hands as though the explanation were obvious. The official asked again. This time Martin didn't answer nearly as fast. Even from where I sat, I recognized that pause. I'd seen it in engineering meetings for years. It was the pause people make when they're searching for a document they suddenly realize never existed. By early afternoon, the temporary construction fencing had been reopened, but nobody looked relaxed anymore. Crews stood around instead of working. Pickup trucks that usually came and went every few minutes stayed parked. Laura called me before I even left the coffee shop. They couldn't produce a recorded authorization, she said. The county has suspended final utility approval until ownership questions are resolved. I asked the only thing that really mattered. Can the building open? There was a short silence. Not legally. The grand opening had been advertised for Saturday. Hundreds of invitations had already gone out. Local business owners had donated supplies. Families were planning to attend. On Thursday afternoon, the announcement quietly appeared on the community website. Due to unforeseen regulatory delays, the recreation center opening would be postponed. They didn't mention inspections. They didn't mention property rights. They certainly didn't mention me. But everyone in the neighborhood already knew something serious had happened, because expensive buildings don't postpone ribbon cuttings over paperwork unless the paperwork is important. Friday evening, there was an emergency HOA meeting. For the first time since I'd moved into Pine Hollow Estates. Residents packed the room until people were standing along the walls. Martin looked exhausted. The confidence he'd worn like an expensive suit had disappeared. Several homeowners demanded answers about the delayed project. Others wanted to know why association attorneys had suddenly been hired. One elderly gentleman stood up and asked the question nobody on the board wanted to hear. Did we really tear down a homeowner's property without legal authority? The room went completely silent. Martin tried explaining that everything had been done for community standards, but the words sounded hollow now. Standards are difficult to defend after documents start contradicting them. The board voted to enter closed session with legal counsel, and less than an hour later my phone rang. Laura answered before I could. When she called me back, her voice was calm as always. They want to settle. We met the following Monday. I didn't ask for revenge. I didn't ask for punishment. I asked for accountability. The agreement required the HOA to pay the full replacement cost of my solar structure using materials equal to or better than the originals. They reimbursed every permit fee, every engineering expense, every temporary charging cost I'd paid while the system was gone, and formally withdrew every violation they had ever issued related to the project. More importantly, they signed a binding property protection agreement requiring written consent before any future action affecting my land. They also covered my legal fees. As for Martin, he resigned before the next monthly meeting. Whether he jumped or was pushed didn't really matter anymore. The project delays, legal expenses, and public embarrassment had already done what anger never could. A few weeks later, construction crews returned to my driveway. This time they worked for me. The new canopy was stronger than the first one, built with upgraded steel supports and higher efficiency panels that generated even more power than before. The foreman joked that maybe someone should put a security camera on top this time. I laughed and told him I already had 6. Mrs. Dawson brought another batch of blueberry muffins the day everything was finished. She stood beside me looking at the completed structure glowing softly in the afternoon sun and smiled. "Looks better than the first one," she said. "It is," I answered. Then she looked over at the unfinished recreation center sitting quietly in the distance and added, "Funny how some people spend so much time trying to control their neighbors that they forget to manage themselves." I thought about that for a long time after she walked home. Looking back now, the strangest part isn't that someone believed they could bulldoze another person's property and get away with it. The strangest part is how many people assumed authority automatically meant they were right. It doesn't. Rules matter. Communities matter. Respect matters. But none of those things give anyone permission to ignore the law simply because they hold a title on a board or a nameplate on an office door. Sometimes the loudest person in the room really does get their way, right up until the paperwork starts speaking for itself. So now I'd like to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have accepted the settlement and moved on, or would you have taken the case all the way through court to make an even bigger point? And where do you think the line is between protecting a neighborhood and abusing power? Share your thoughts in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around, because trust me, this wasn't the last time I learned that the quietest person on the block sometimes has the strongest hand.